The entire chemistry lab went so silent you could hear the frantic ticking of the clock on the back wall. 60 students held their breath, their eyes darting between the chalkboard and the young man standing at the front of the room. Professor Sterling, a man whose ego was as massive as his Ivy League reputation, leaned back against his mahogany desk, a cruel, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He had just handed Elias Vance a task that wasn't just difficult, it was a death sentence for a grade. "Well, Mr. Vance," Sterling's voice dripped with a feigned politeness that felt like acid. "You've spent the last 3 weeks sitting in the back of my hall, staring out the window. Since you clearly find my lectures beneath you, why don't you show us how a natural talent handles the Reimer-Tiemann synthesis of an unstable phenolic compound? Most PhD candidates fail this on their first 3 tries. But for you, I'm sure it's just child's play." Elias didn't move at first. He stood there, his worn backpack slumped over one shoulder, looking remarkably out of place in a room filled with high-end equipment and students from the wealthiest zip codes in the country. To Sterling, Elias was just a quota, a kid from a struggling neighborhood who had probably cheated his way into a scholarship. What Sterling didn't know was that while the other students were out at high society mixers, Elias was spending his nights in the basement of the university library, teaching himself quantum chemistry from journals the professors hadn't touched in a decade. The challenge was a trap. The specific reagents Sterling had pulled from the cabinet were slightly past their shelf life, unstable, volatile, and prone to a violent exothermic reaction if the temperature fluctuated by even half a degree. Sterling wasn't just looking for an incorrect answer. He was looking for a spectacular, embarrassing failure. He wanted to prove that Elias didn't belong in this world of elite science. Elias stepped toward the lab bench. He didn't reach for his goggles immediately. Instead, he looked at the glassware, his eyes moving with a strange, predatory precision. He picked up a flask, tilting it toward the light. The class whispered. A few students snickered, expecting him to drop it. But then, the snickering stopped. Without looking at the manual, Elias began to move. His hands were a blur of calculated motion. He adjusted the Bunsen burner not by the dial, but by the color of the flame, watching for that perfect, invisible blue. He began pouring the reagents, but he wasn't following Sterling's instructions. He was adding them in a sequence that made Sterling's eyes widen in confusion. "What are you doing, Vance? I told you to add the chloroform first. You're going to cause a flash fire." Sterling stepped forward, his face turning a deep shade of red. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He spoke in a voice that was quiet, steady, and carried the weight of absolute certainty. "If I add the chloroform now, the impurity in your batch of sodium hydroxide will catalyze a premature reaction. The flask will shatter in 3 seconds. But if I buffer it with a diluted acetic solution first, the reaction stabilizes." The flask hummed. A beautiful, deep violet vapor began to swirl inside the glass, a color that Sterling had only seen in textbooks, never in his own lab. The temperature gauge on the digital readout stayed exactly at 45.0 degrees. It didn't flicker. It didn't move. The room was paralyzed. Students stood up from their chairs to get a better look. This wasn't just a student performing an experiment. This was a master at work. Elias began scribbling on the chalkboard behind him, writing out the molecular bond shifts. But he wasn't just writing the formula Sterling had asked for. He was correcting a fundamental flaw in the professor's own published research from 2 years prior. "The reason your yield was always below 60%, Professor," Elias said, still writing, the chalk clicking rapidly against the board, "is because you accounted for the solvent as a passive agent. But at this pressure, it becomes a reactant. If you shift the equilibrium here, you don't just get the compound, you get a 99% pure synthesis." Professor Sterling's jaw literally dropped. He looked at the board, then at the violet liquid, then back at the board. His mind raced, trying to find a flaw, a mistake, anything to reclaim his authority. But there was nothing. The math was perfect. The chemistry was flawless. It was a discovery that would change the industry, and it had just been performed by a 20-year-old kid he had tried to humiliate. Where did you learn that?" Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting realization. Elias finally stopped writing. He set the chalk down and turned around, looking Sterling directly in the eye. "I've been reading your papers since I was 14, Professor. I used to write to you on the Global Chem Forum under the name Apex 99. I pointed this error out to you 3 months ago in a private message. You blocked me. You told me I wasn't qualified to critique your work." Sterling stumbled back, hitting his desk. He remembered that user. He had spent weeks trying to figure out which rival scientist at Oxford or MIT was mocking him online. He never imagined it was the quiet kid sitting in the back of his own classroom. The silence in the lab was now deafening. Every student was looking at Sterling with a mixture of shock and newfound realization. The prodigy wasn't the man with the title. It was the man with the passion. "Vance, I didn't realize," Sterling began, his voice trembling. "That's the problem, Professor," Elias said, grabbing his backpack. "You spend so much time looking at the pedigree, you forgot to look at the science. I don't need this grade. I just wanted to see if you were as good as your book said you were." Elias turned and walked toward the door. As his hand touched the handle, he paused. "By the way, the reaction in that flask will stay stable for another 10 minutes. I'd suggest you bottle it. It's the only pure sample you'll ever have." That day, the lab didn't just witness a chemical reaction. They witnessed the death of an old way of thinking. Professor Sterling sat in his empty lab for hours afterward, staring at the chalkboard, a broken man who had finally been taught his most important lesson. The world is full of brilliant minds hidden in the places we refuse to look. We are taught to respect the suit, the title, and the corner office. But genius doesn't care about your background. It doesn't care about your zip code. It only cares about the truth. Never judge a book by its cover, because the person you try to push down might just be the one who's already miles ahead of you. Stay humble, stay curious, and most importantly, stay ready, because greatness doesn't announce itself, it simply arrives.